Live. Welcome everyone to our special Oki Day edition of our Greece 200 series, How Regions Won the Revolution. This, as we said, is a year-long initiative where we'll be discussing, as young members of the diaspora, we'll be putting together presentations, both verbal and written, discussing the history of the Greek Revolution, its impact on modern day, and all sorts of bicentennial-related events. This is in conjunction with the Sons of Pericles Cultural Committee, and this particular presentation is being held by the Greenville Sons of Pericles. So I want to quickly, just being that it's Oki Day, read what I thought was an empowering quote a little bit by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, an AHEPA member, of course. When the entire world had lost all hope, the Greek people dared to question the invincibility of the German monster, raising against it the proud spirit of freedom. So again, FDR, former US president and AHEPA member, shows that Greece stood up to fascism at the time, fought for freedom, and that's what we're discussing here, is another time when Greece fought for freedom. It's fitting that Greece, as a frankly small power relatively, has always stood firmly in its Hellenic values. And it's fitting to me that part 2 of our series then takes us to Hydra, which is self-proclaimed as a small rock, but a rock of liberty nonetheless, that always stood for what was right and stood for freedom, right? So without further ado, we'll introduce our panelists today. Of course, I'm moderating as Paul Pavlakos, Sons Cultural Committee Chair and co-chair of the Greece 200 Committee. We have with us today Alex Billinis, who is an AHEPA member, author and historian, current instructor at Clemson University, has a background as well in law, real estate, and banking, and is the current Greenville Sons advisor. We have with him his son, John Billinis, who is the president of the Greenville Sons of Pericles chapter, a junior in high school, and from what we hear is quite the athlete. He is a member of his high school tennis team, currently being made captain this year, I believe, and plays competitively as well, has been ranked top 20 in the state of South Carolina for competitive tennis. So Alex, John, welcome to you both. And it's great to have you both. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. With John, we'll have you kick us off. So Greece, of course, we know is famous really for its islands. Each have their own history. They each have their own geography. Can you indicate for us Hydra's location in the Aegean, describe to us its geography, topography, kind of give us a background of where it is?
Yeah, I would love to. I appreciate the very nice introduction. So Hydra is east of the Peloponnesos, southeast of Athens, in the western part of the Aegean Sea. And Hydra is quite the opposite of flat. It doesn't have any fertile soil and it's very rocky. I have been there on numerous occasions, and it's a very pretty island. And even though Hydra has a prefix water, it still needs water to bring to the island. So very pretty, but not flat at all, very rocky.
Thanks, John. And continuing to set the stage, kind of, I think it's always important to get a little bit of background and context to the regions and subjects we're discussing. So continuing on that, this question's for Alex. At the time, so we're going into 1821, we'll set the stage leading up to the revolution. At that time, what were the demographics of Hydra? What were its cultural, economic, political environments? I know last week we discussed in Macedonia how certain treaties affected maritime trade, for example, in Greece. So what was the climate overall in Hydra at the time leading up to 1821?
Sure. Hydra, in a country as ancient as Greece, where you've got like 4,000 years of history. Now, there's been some excavations that have shown that Hydra did have some interesting ancient history, but Hydra really enters Greek history around 1600, where more and more refugees from infighting on the Peloponnesos, fighting between the Turks and Venetians, came to the island because it was rocky and forbidding, and it wasn't a target because it wasn't a wealthy place. But like so many Aegean islanders from time immemorial, they took to the sea. The sea was their opportunity for feeding themselves and for eventually creating a fortune. So By 1820, Hydra had one of the largest fleets in the Mediterranean. It had the first and longest running till today, nautical academy. It had major relations with key ports like Marseille, Trieste in what's now Italy, Marseille in France, Odessa, which is now in the Ukraine, but was in the Russian Empire. You mentioned treaties. Well, certainly the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kanarji was a major impetus for the growth of the Hydriot Navy, because even though we think of flags of convenience as something newer to the Greek merchant fleet, well, Greeks were arbitraging flags even back then. So the Hydriots could fly the Ottoman flag, or they could fly the Russian flag as Orthodox subjects of the Sultan, and that gave them other privileges and protections, and the Hydriots used it to very good effect. By 1820, there were about 20,000 people on the island, which is over 10 times the population currently. The island also had virtual autonomy from the Turks because of its commercial importance. The key to that, though, was that Hydra had to provide a levy of some of its best sailors for the Turkish Navy every year. But that ended up being good because the Hydriots had further military training and also knew Turkish tactics.
Thanks, Alex. And I particularly am always interested to hear. We mentioned, how it affected Odessa, how it affected Trieste, how it affected all of these different ports across Europe. So we're seeing already leading up to 1821 European influence with Greece, vice versa. And John, I guess we'll move into 1821 itself then. When did Hydra actually join the revolution?
So Hydra joined the revolution April 16th, 1821. One day after my birthday. My birthday's April 15th. If everybody wants to get me something, that would be great. But April 16th, 1821, there was a fair amount of initial hesitation, though. And the middle class really drove and insisted that that Hydra joins the revolution, and it eventually did. April 16th, 1821.
And I know for Alex now, we're talking about a thriving maritime trade, and it was still Ottoman occupation, but relatively Hydra economically was doing well. It had, as you described in your story map that we've been kind of reading into, it had agency at that time, right? It had a thriving economic situation. So as opposed to other regions that might have had it worse, what were Hydra's motivations really for getting involved in the revolution?
Well, it was a problem because a lot of, Hydra had done very well as a privileged part of the Ottoman Empire. But I think ultimately there were too many Hydriots who were members of the Filikieteria, which, as you know, of course, Paul, was founded in Odessa. Hydriots, as some of the most intrepid travelers, were all over the Greek world. So they were becoming more and more involved with the currents of Greek independence, with the ideas of nationalism. They were also conscious that they were Orthodox Christians in a Muslim empire that treated them as third-class citizens in spite of their privileged status, which could change at any time. I mean, the privilege was based on Hydra's wealth, commercial power, and potentially the difficulty of controlling them if you chose a military option. At the same time, if the Peloponnesos is in revolt and other parts of Greece are in revolt, and given that Hydra is right next door to the Peloponnesos, they couldn't remain idle. So many Hydriots were recent Peloponnesians. So, this is their kith and kin that are revolting, and they couldn't stand idle. And ultimately, as my son points out, the middle classes in particular, like in most revolutions, I think history will show, it's the middle class people that actually drive the revolution. And for them, the concept of agency wasn't just being, financially have financial agency, but to have national agency and national dignity. And that could only happen via a successful revolution.
So right, so financial agency, wealth, as history has shown us for Greeks isn't enough, right? We've always had this kind of wanting of more, of independence, of freedom, those values we've been willing to sacrifice kind of wealth, lives, and livelihood for, right? For those Hellenic values.
I would say so, yes.
And you mentioned the middle class, and of course, throughout revolutions, throughout history, really, it is a middle class effort, right? Revolutions are a movement by the people for the people, almost, really. So we have the middle class; they're pushing for this. One of them, I believe, at the time was Andonis Ekonomou. So, John, the next question for you is: could you describe who Andonis Ekonomou was and what were his contributions to the revolution?
Yeah, sure. Andonis Ekonomou was a captain, and he led the popular revolt and kind of led the push to join the revolution in April of 1821. Though the leading ship owners went all in, and he had a lot of supporters, especially in the middle class and mostly in the ship owners. After that, there was a great deal of backlash and resentment for his actions, and he was actually later on killed, probably at the instigation of the leading ship owners.
So no good deed goes unpunished.
Interesting, and there are a lot of common themes through studying the revolution in every region that you see. One of them is kind of this infighting is a strong word, but these disagreements that we see, and we also see a common theme of disorganization. Not everything was a coordinated strategy, as through the eyes of history, it kind of seems like this was all one movement, but in the present, when you really look into it, you can realize a lot of these were sporadic movements that were headed by different leaders. There wasn't a common organization system here. There wasn't even a common leader. So, Alex, for you, was Hydra a victim of that, just like the other regions? What were its experiences with disorganization?
Well, I mean, look, we're Greeks after all. Organization is not necessarily our strong suit. The problem in Greece so much of the times is that there were different locuses of power, and certainly as the strongest naval island with a lot to contribute both in terms of naval power and financial power, the Hydriots wanted things their way. So coordination between Hydra and, let's say, the captains of the Peloponnese or Rumeli, Macedonia, Crete, that was very weak. Having said that, the naval coordination between the three nautical islands, and I think it's important to give due to our neighbor Spetses, which was the second largest naval island, and then this also a very tiny island, but in terms of numbers, and then the tiny island of Psara off of the island of Chios in the eastern Aegean that also contributed mightily a fleet and was actually taken by the Turks and destroyed for their efforts. But the islands operated quite well as a squadron, but once they touched land, not so much.
That's a fair analysis, and I know having done some research, you tend to always see Hydra, Spetses, and Psara mentioned together as kind of a triumvirate there of naval support, of nautical significance throughout that war. So it is telling kind of that dichotomy between the land forces and the naval forces, how they interacted with each other. But of course, there's as you say, we are Greeks, and so disorganization is always going to be something that we face, but clearly it was overcome, right, as we see now.
Yes.
John, for you though, I mean, disorganization is one thing, but in other regions we've seen actual internal conflict where things were, activities were counterproductive to the war at the sake of personal power, wealth, whatever it may be, maybe not believing in the cause, maybe different strategies, but there was a lot of internal conflict. Nothing was easy. Was any of that experienced in Hydra?
That's a good question, and to be honest, not really particularly, and not saying that there probably wasn't some internal conflict there, and I mean there obviously is the way you want to have a different strategy, the way you approach something, you have to be very thoughtful and technical in the process, but in general, not really. It was a war for survival. You don't really have time to make up these big arguments and to have fights and all that when you're really at a war for survival. And most people, even though there was initial hesitation, most people realized that this was they wanted this, and they were really patriotic, and they really wanted to support the cause for freedom. And so, to answer your question, not really.
Okay. And that's, I think you bring up the flip side of the coin, right? Again, as Greeks, though, we can be disorganized, but our patriotism holds to a point, our strength to our values holds to a point to where we can put that aside for a common cause when really push comes to shove. So I think that's beneficial, and it's good to hear, because we eventually had to come together for that success, right? That we experienced back then and even now, right? So we're actually we've started the revolution. Now we're in the phase of the revolution. And Alex, Hydra is known for its individual efforts, but also the support that it provided to other regions in the whole of Greece, right? So what supplies and resources did it have at its disposal? What did it provide to other regions, including whether it be ships, sailors, arms, whatever it could be?
Okay, most sources cite a figure of about 150 ships that Hydra had available for the struggle. Now, when we're talking about ships, we're not talking about purpose-built naval ships. We're talking about converted merchant ships. So that's very important to understand. So rather than the types of frigates that were common in the Ottoman Navy, and of course even more common, let's say, in the American Navy or the British, the French Navy, double decker, 20 guns on each side. I mean, you're typically talking about a converted merchant ship with maybe 12 guns. This was pretty much the standard Hydriot, ship. Now, these ships, of course, had an advantage in that they were piloted by some of the best sailors on Earth. And I'm not just saying that with pride as a Hydriot, but these sailors would often be apprenticed from the age of 7. You also had a highly competent and technocratic naval academy, but you also cut your teeth against some pretty tough customers, the Barbary pirates, the same Barbary pirates that the American Navy fought in the war with Tripoli in 1805. They also had a lot of experience in their own piracy, let's be honest, and during the Napoleonic Wars, blockade running, the British blockade into French ports. That's really what made the very, very large fortune for Hydra was blockade running, like taking Russian wheat into starving Marseille. So you had extremely well-trained sailors who also were quite wealthy. I mean, there are stories of the big mansions in Hydra being full of gold, at least at the start of revolution. At the end, not so much. What they lacked in terms of size, they made up for in terms of agility and skill and firepower. And what the importance of naval power is that, particularly in a country of islands and peninsulas, you can both project force onto land and you can prevent people from landing. So I don't know if maybe that's a little too much detail right now, but Hydra didn't have like Marines landing forces in. Basically, the Hydriots were most comfortable on water.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we will get into a little bit of the actual activities that Hydra participated in, events that occurred, I think. But one thing that I do want to pick up again, and keeping in some common themes, is throughout the year we have these discussions. We're discussing now regional revolutions, different regional participation, but later on in the year, as we know, we'll be curious, why does this apply to us? What were the outside impacts? And so we already see here a little bit, and Alex, I think, I feel free to add on to this or correct me if I'm misstating, but we have certain treaties that are building up maritime trade. Those same commercial ships which were built up for maritime trade are now being used to fight off the Ottomans. They're trained against the Barbary pirates. They're then using that same training to fight off the Ottomans again, right? So we see here European influence on the Greek Revolution already, things that happened 20, 30 years ago ending up having kind of an impact on what occurred during those revolutionary activities.
That's absolutely the case. And for example, given the presence of a Greek commercial network throughout the Austrian Empire, throughout the former Venetian Empire, in southern France, all over the Black Sea, and it wasn't just Odessa. I mean, there was settlement of Greeks and other Balkan peoples, Serbs and Bulgarians, en masse into the Austrian and Ottoman empires. So you had your own people, or if not your own people, your own co-religionists that were established in these European states. The first newspaper in the Greek world was from Vienna, okay? So, you had people that were very much involved with the states that they were living in, and they were keeping their fellow Greeks via this very strong merchant network well informed. So Greeks felt an active participant in the affairs of Europe, and they wanted to join Europe, which is part of the reason why they wanted to get rid of the Ottomans.
And we'll definitely follow up on this. I think for what we plan on having some further presentations later on in the year that I think can delve further into that, because I mean, that's a whole separate conversation in its own, right? Is the impact of Europe and kind of the relationship that Greece had with the rest of Europe, both before, during, and after the revolution, I think are all three separate impacts. So focusing that in, again, Alex, now we've talked about the supplies and resources that they've provided, but what were the actual activities that occurred? I know you alluded to a little bit, a lot of Hydra's benefit kind of was preventing Ottoman forces from landing on the Greek mainland, which of course helped all the other regions tremendously. So could you talk a little bit about how Hydra used its own resources to participate in the revolution?
Okay, first of all, if I were to say the most important thing would probably be the preventing a Turkish landing, because as you know, the south of Greece is a series of peninsulas. Don't look at the superhighways that are built now with the EU funds. I mean, traveling north to south in Greece is an endurance sport, and there's plenty of places to fight off an enemy. I mean, just going back into ancient times, the Pass of Thermopylae, Turks were being ambushed on that same pass as they were coming south. The Isthmus of Corinth. I mean, there's a lot of places to attack an army coming from the north. Were it not for Hydra, Spetses, and Psara providing a screen against the Ottomans could have, via the forts they initially controlled in the Peloponnese, like Monemvasia, Kodon, Moron, Patras, they could resupply their garrisons and snuff out the revolution. So the ability to prevent Turkish landings, in my opinion, is huge. Then, of course, you have, actual engagement and destruction or pushing back, Turkish forces. And this happened in, over, a dozen battles, big and small, where Turkish fleets simply could not match the skill of Hydra and the other two fleets. Now, were there setbacks? Yes, there were. There was the loss of Psara, there was the loss of Kassos. When Ibrahim Pasha brought in his French and British trained fleet and ships, the Hydriots were unable to fully prevent a landing, okay? And then they switched more to a defensive role in protecting their, themselves. But the ability to engage and defeat the Ottomans and then prevent landings, particularly in the beginning of the war, I think was key.
Got it. And aside from, in addition, curiosity on my end, in addition to kind of providing that naval support, were there any actual conflicts on the island of Hydra, or was a lot of it stayed naval and on the mainland?
If you go into Hydra's port today, and everyone should, because it's, again, I know we're biased, but it's one of the most gorgeous places on the planet. You will be faced on both sides of the port with gun embrasures that were built in the Revolutionary era, and they were used. So it wasn't that there weren't engagements close to home, but the Ottomans never set foot on Hydra. One of the things that Hydra did do is it brought in civilians from the island of Spetses, because Spetses is even closer to the mainland, and there was a fear that Spetses was going to be taken. But no Ottoman ever set foot on Hydra. That never happened.
Got it. And you mentioned taking in people from other islands, and that was something we saw a lot last week with the Macedonia conversation, and I'm sure others. But a lot of leaders, a lot of frankly refugees of Ottoman war-torn areas ended up fleeing to the islands, specifically Hydra, Spetses, Psara as well. But a lot went to Hydra, including Emmanuel Papas. So it seems like that was a pretty common role of Hydra to kind of be provide that free look in what we see a lot still, right? A little bit. So it was necessary and well taken, I think, even back then.
Well, and not only Greeks, but a lot of Philhellenes, Samuel Gridley Howe, who I think is someone, and I know that you and I have talked about this on many occasions, but he's someone that we can be very proud of as Americans. He went and served and fought for Greece. He was familiar with the island. George Washington Townsend is buried on the island. The nephew of President Washington was there. So there were lots of people that passed through Hydra in the course of the revolution, either passing through for military purposes, or, as you mentioned, seeking refuge. So this was absolutely a role of the island, and the island was protected by its fleet.
And part of that fleet, which brings us to our next question, I think, from research, again, they seem as cool as they sound. Hydra had fire ships at its disposal, right? Which, for those not familiar with them, could you explain the concept of the fire ships, how they were used by Hydra and the rest of the islands?
Okay, well, first of all, fire ships are pretty much as old as naval warfare, okay? Light a log on fire and then crash it into a ship, watch the ship burn, the sailors, turn into, toast. This has happened, throughout history, and including in more modern eras. Fire ships are an asymmetric weapon, all right? So as we already have established, the Hydriot ships were smaller, outgunned, more maneuverable, piloted by better sailors. The fire ship is that, for lack of a better word, on steroids. Basically, you would take an old, smaller ship, you would fill it with gunpowder and pitch, cotton, other combustibles. You would cut out hatches to make the fire go even quicker. You would have lots of grappling hooks and yards and basically anything designed to get it to stick to an enemy ship. You would then get your best, you would have a skeleton crew of your absolute best sailors, who would, as silently as possible, pilot the ship there. They would get into a rowboat, light the train, and take off. One of the biggest things they had going for them was absolute panic, because, most of the Turkish sailors couldn't swim. Okay, so the fire ship meant death. Okay, and a lot of times the panic would make it impossible to fight off the fire ships. So The asymmetric value of fire ships was key to so many naval battles, and obviously we can talk about some specific ones, but it was the asymmetric weapon that the Greek fleet and all of the islands used to devastating effect against the Turks. To give you an idea of how audacious they were, they tried, and in this case failed. They sailed to Alexandria in Egypt and tried to burn the Egyptian fleet. Okay, we missed that one, but we got other ones.
One of the naval battles actually too, and I included the use of fire ships, was the Battle of Samos, right? In 1824, we had the Battle of Samos. John, do you want to kind of walk us through what happened there?
Yeah, I would love to. And the one thing to add what my father said is, just from a blatant standpoint, fire ships are super cool. I mean, the way that, I mean, they were devastating and all, but just from a person that's not really that much into, you know, naval powers and all that, when I heard about Hydra first using the fire ships for my dad, I was like, did you know about this? And he goes, yeah, well, of course I knew. And he explained it to me, and I was like, wow, that is super cool. But going back to your question was about Battle of Samos, and Samos was, I mean, it's a brave island with brave people and a very beautiful island. It's right next to the Turks, Turkish mainland, and it's really close by. I mean, you could probably swim to it, and it's super close, so you can see it in the distance, and it's crazy close to see an island that is that close to Turkey fought so bravely that it took Turkey so long and so much work to just take over one island that was super close by them. And Hydra and Spetses and Psara saved Samos from a Turkish landing, actually, with several fire ships attacks. 3 major Turkish frigates were destroyed, 1,000 Turks were killed, and to 6 Greek fire ships and 3 dead Greek sailors, that's nothing, especially as we mentioned, Turkey is this big country with a lot of people and a way bigger navy and a way bigger army, and the ratio is crazy. And so to see 3 small islands work together as a squadron to not only defeat, but to give a heavy blow to the Turkish Navy and army, even for an island that's probably closer to Turkey than it is to Greece, is crazy. And it just shows that even though they're small islands, they can be really powerful, and they really do matter in various cases. And this is one of them.
Yeah, I think that's well taken. I mean, I've been to Samos. In my opinion, it's one of the more underrated islands there is. You can, in fact, see Turkey from the eastern side. It's even closer than you think. And that, of course, as we know, comes into play later on in history. Once you get into it, is part of Asia Minor. So once you get into the Greek genocide area, 1913 to 22, you see a lot of cross migration, population movement there. A lot of, again, because of one of the themes we want to cover is ancestry, right? So when we're talking Samos, we're talking people's ancestors being born in Turkey but growing up in Samos, or vice versa. And there's a lot of a lot of relationships there. So it's interesting that even back in the revolution, you still have this notion of this underrated, underweight, underdog island of Samos, close to Turkey, but still holding those Hellenic values. And again, at the risk of saying geography doesn't necessarily shape culture, right? So that the geography is closer to Turkey, but its values, its religion, its intentions were very Hellenic at its roots. So it's a good example you bring up there, John, in the Battle of Samos. So we've talked a lot about kind of how Hydra participated in the revolution itself. One thing kind of that we then focus on is later on in the revolution, right? There was obviously the formation of the first Hellenic Republic at some point. How did that formation affect Hydra? We know that it was a maritime trade before the heavy maritime trade, very successful in the maritime industry before the revolution. Once the Hellenic Republic was established, Alex, what was the impact on Hydra?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When the Hellenic state, was first established, obviously the Hydriots rejoiced, they had their agency, their national agency, but their economy was in tatters. They gave their all. And Hydra never recovered its naval preeminence. That started to shift to other Aegean islands, places like Syros, Chios, Kefalonia, Andros, Kassos took over from there. A lot of the Hydriots, though, did kind of get absorbed into the new Greek elite in Athens. So a lot of the prominent Hydriot families or branches of them moved in and were then assimilated into the new Greek elite. So Hydra itself never recovered. Just to give you an idea, in 1850, that's 20 years after the revolution, a Hydriot grandee told the then Queen Amalia of Greece that Hydra has nothing to offer but prickly pears in abundance, excellent sea captains, and a few good prime ministers. So, Hydra did not recover. I mean, the Hydriots always had a place of honor. We had our own flag. We always had separate parliamentary representation. Certainly, the Naval Academy, which I've written a great deal about, was preeminent. I mean, just to give you an idea, the first Naval Academy for Merchant Marines in the U.S. was established in 1871. It's about 130 years after the one in Hydra. So Hydra, the Naval Academy itself, turned out hundreds and hundreds of classes, which basically gave the manpower and the technocratic expertise to the Greek merchant fleet. But Hydra itself never recovered. I mean, a simple example is from 20,000 plus people, now it's 2,000. And, I don't think any time after the revolution, it's been more than 4 or 5. So if population is any example, the Hydriots pretty much gave their all. Now, having said that, I talk about naval expertise. You had the Hydriot Admiral Pavlos Kurduliotis, who in the Balkan Wars presided over massive victories against the Turks. And since we're talking about naval power and history repeating itself, it's not just that the Turkish Navy was defeated. The Balkan allies, so Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria, that were mopping up Macedonia and Thrace, didn't have to face Turkish troops that the Turks could otherwise have ferried right into Thessaloniki and Kavala to fight the Greeks and Bulgarians and Serbians. So the fact that the Greek Navy shut the Aegean down meant that the Turks couldn't bring all their forces to bear. And Bulgarian General Slavov, who was the head of the Bulgarian High Command, specifically said the Greek Navy was the key to their massive victories in Thrace. So honor is due.
Very much so. And I think that's a good segue into our final formal question. Full circle, of course, the title of this series is How Regions Won the Revolution, right? So we're focused on how each particular region had enough of an impact on the revolution to be a cause, if not one of the main causes of the victory. What was Hydra's in summation? In summation, if you could kind of shortly put together what we've heard here, why did Hydra contribute to the ultimate Greek victory in the Greek War of Independence?
Well, look, we're Hydriots, okay? So we're biased. And my late father was a Hydriot, and he was very clear that no Hydra, no revolution. It would have been stillborn. Given the importance of establishing quickly a foothold in the Peloponnesian Rumeli, without the screen of ships that Hydra and Spetses and Psara provided, that probably wouldn't have happened. Then, of course, you have the actual defeats of the Turks at sea and the financial contribution of Hydra. Again, call me biased. I don't think it would have happened. The revolution probably would have been stillborn. I don't say that Greece wouldn't have become free later on, because there was momentum that if it didn't happen this time, it might have happened another time, but not this time.
Yeah, and I think even more so, there were some people who would have preferred it would have happened at a later time, right? But it happened when it happened, thankfully so. And I think bias aside, even in accounts from people not from the region, you hear plenty of discussion on Hydra Spetses and the island's roles in supporting the revolution and causing its victory and helping it get off the ground. So again, point well taken. Thank you both for your time and for answering these questions. We'll kind of close it off with some closing remarks from each of you. So Alex, why don't you kind of kick it off with closing remarks, if you don't mind?
Well, Hydra is an island that really believed in agency from the get-go. I'm very proud to be on Hydra's 2021 committee, as well as on the American Hellenic 2021 committee. It's a great deal of pride for me. It was really about finding agency, both national and personal. And this is something that's very important to all Greeks, but I think it's sharper in Hydriots. Maybe it's just a function of that rocky island that we come from, that, you know, you have to work hard in order to build a life. But the honey of Hydra, you know, there's not a lot of flowers for the honey to pollinate on. I'm probably not using the right term, but there's no sweeter honey than on Hydra. And again, bias call me, but it's a great place to be from. I'm proud to be a citizen of Hydra. It's and particularly to celebrate it at this bicentennial.
Great, yeah, and I mean, you know, frankly, just to add on to that, and then we'll move to John. I think it's for the best that we have people from the area talk about their own area, right? Because as we've said all along, the point of doing this regional conversation is because, yes, we are Greeks, we are proud of Greece as a country, but even more so, sometimes we can be proud of being Hydriot. We can be proud of our region, or Hydriot, our island, that has some sort of significance to us on a personal level, on a much more personal level, because at that point, you're even potentially talking ancestry as well. Those are where your roots really are, and that's why it's important to have people with those roots have these conversations. So I think it's actually a plus in my mind to be talking about Hydra by Hydriots for everyone, right? John, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, from a kid that's lived in America for most of his life, and though I love America and I love this country, I also am proud to be Greek, whether it's, you know, the revolution, or whether it's Oki Day and standing up for what's right, or whether it's just as simple as winning in the European Cup in 2004 against Portugal. No matter what kind of stride, the Greeks have a way of coming together when it matters most. And like we said, we're the type of people that we will argue and fight amongst ourselves, but as soon as someone talks crap about us, we'll stand together and make sure that we show them who we really are. And on a personal note, I mean, I lived in Greece as a kid in Athens, and I visited either on multiple occasions, and it is beautiful. And Greece itself is a very beautiful country, but my papu, my dad's dad, I never really got to meet him and actually talk to him and get to know him. And I heard many great stories about him, and specifically in Hydra. And so not only is it my way to connect with Greece and my ancestors from Greece and my Greek family, it's also a way to kind of hear stories about my papu that I genuinely wouldn't get to hear, that I wouldn't get to know. And you know, he's in a much better place, and he's I heard such a smart guy and an incredible person, and those stories really originated from Hydra. And so not just Hydra being important to Greece and Greek history, it's important to me because it's a sense of family and a connection to Greece that I otherwise wouldn't have. And so I'm proud to be Greek, and I'm proud to be Hydriot.
That's great, John. Yeah, no, that's great to hear, and of course, that's partially why we do this. Very, very much so. So, thank you both for your time. I'll just close off a little bit. Thank you everyone again for joining us. Again, happy Lucky Day to everybody. We celebrate the constant Greek standing up towards oppression. Join us November 11th will be part 3 and the final part of this series, How Regions Won the Revolution. We'll be discussing something that in my opinion is actually very related to what we've already discussed. We're discussing Mani and Laconia on November 11th. So the Hydriot flag has one thing we didn't mention, Itan Iepitas on it, right? With your shield or dead upon it, which is of course the famous ancient Spartan phrase that we heard during the Battle of Thermopylae, which is also being celebrated in this next year and a half or so. So very related, very fitting. We will be discussing, again, November 11th, 7 p.m. This particular presentation will be by the Washington, D.C. Sons of Pericles. So be sure to join us on that day. And thank you, everyone, for watching.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.